Hello, everyone, and welcome to a last edition of the week on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you, as always, by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you guys yet again for tuning in to today's show. Hope you all enjoyed the start of the NFL season last night. Fascinating game between the Chiefs and the Ravens came down to the last play of the game. Really enthralling, especially in terms of fantasy perspectives. So if you have any opinions about that game, feel free to leave them in the comments. But before we get into some of the more exciting business pertaining to this weekend's games in both the NFL and in college football, if you are so a fan of that, we do have some for all those last-minute stragglers in your fantasy football drafts, draft or pass series, if you are pondering who to target and who to avoid should you be drafting anytime soon. As we get down to the nitty-gritty of the NFL season, we have two wide receivers. We also have a little segment where I try to decipher how to pick and value different defenses in fantasy football, because a lot of people might overlook the defenses. So it should be an overarching, fascinating segment to end the week, fascinating show to end the week. But before we get into all of the excitement and hype surrounding today's show, I do want to remind you all to consider liking, following, and subscribing to the show and the network as a whole. Everything you do for both the shows and the networks are greatly appreciated by all. If you haven't already, make yourselves available to the many features that we have to offer on YouTube now that we are a live show. The Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features will do just fine. Tips and donations are included in that as well. So if you do feel so inclined, consider leaving that. It is one of the best parts of my show. I love interacting with you, my faithful audience. So if you have any questions, comments, concerns, opinions, trades you might want to get analyzed, waiver wire advice, anything, leave it and feel free to do whatever you want outside of that as well, to appreciate the show and the network as a whole. In return, we appreciate you for all you do for it. Without further ado, let's jump right into today's show. Let's start off with some draft or pass segments, and then I promise we'll get to some more exciting segments at the end of today's show. I know you're chomping at the bit to talk about betting, talk about some fantasy as well. But before we get into that, for all of you last-minute drafters out there wondering who should I pick up, these segments are for you. My first draft or pass segment of the day lies in an interesting situation. This receiver is one I've truly loved and has truly gone under the radar. As someone who has had consistently dominant seasons, hasn't really had a QB that he can rely upon for many of them, but this year might be different. I think this team as a whole that he's on is going to be one of the sneakiest teams. Maybe not in terms of getting a playoff berth, but they are going to surprise a lot of people and potentially put up a lot of points this season. They're going to be in a lot of shootouts, and this guy might just be the X factor in all of that. So without further ado, let's talk about the draft or pass status of Terry McLaurin. Now, Terry McLaurin is one of those players who I really think fits so well into the offense he's in right now. Because when I look at how the Washington Commanders have evolved to this point, how they've gotten here, they've really revamped how they thought about the offense. They've really decided to hone in on one kind of image of a number one wide receiver and then supplement him with other pieces. Because let's say they were going into the season with both Terry McLaurin and Jahan Dotson. This could be a very different story that I'll be telling you. But now in the absence of Jahan Dotson, even though they have a lot of pieces that excite me, they bring in Zacchaeus from his exploits with the Falcons and Eagles. They bring in Luke McCaffrey through the draft. Ben Sinnott, an exciting young tight end. They also signed Zach Ertz. They still have Brian Robinson Jr. They added Austin Eckler. All of these pieces are really complementing not just Jaden Daniels, who will be their new rookie QB, but they believe that Terry McLaurin's the star of the show. So all the pieces that are surrounding him are more in terms of supplementary pieces than, overwhelming the targets that Terry McLaurin will garner in this offense. Because now I can see him, what with, the absence of a true wide receiver 2, even though there were a lot of good depth behind him, he is now the true wide receiver 1 in the system. So let's talk about how some of his stats from last year might translate to better stats this year. He did have 70-plus catches, 1,000 yards in each of the past 4 seasons. He was wide open, actually. This is an interesting stat on 16% of his routes last year. However, it did not necessarily translate to fantasy production. He was the wide receiver, 29 overall. This year, he's projected to have 123 targets, even though last year he had a career worst yards per target with 7.6 and yards per reception with 12.7, and 27 more wide receivers scored more fantasy points than him. So it did look dire last season, but I don't necessarily think it was all his fault. This year, I think the offense will be primed for him to really have an explosive year where he becomes the true star. Because last year, a lot of different issues befell the Washington Commanders, whether it be the inconsistency of Sam Howell, whether it be the inconsistency of the O-line, whether it be because kind of the forced offensive scheme. I think this year there will be a lot more clarity. And it might seem weird because of all the pieces they added, how all of them will fit together. But I do know one thing, Jaden Daniels will really appreciate having a guy like Terry McLaurin there because he is a wide receiver 1 who's just so versatile. He can get down the field vertically, can run a lot of different routes, can be used in many different ways. He doesn't necessarily even have to catch the ball. He doesn't even necessarily have to score. He just can manipulate the field in so many different ways, and I'm excited to see how he pairs with Jaden Daniels. So I think the main reason why a lot of people might not want to draft him is because there could be a hidden gem on the Washington Commanders offense. I'm not saying that Zacchaeus or McCaffrey are going to be overwhelmingly fantastic this year, but I'm just saying that a lot of people might be skeptical about what the Washington Commanders did this offseason by adding so much depth. As Shep Easy Sweet Spot says, how about likely on waivers? Yes, thank you for this comment, Shep Easy Sweet Spot. A comment that pertains to last night's game. As I said, if you are interested in talking about last night's game, I will be up for it. How about likely on waivers is the question. I love him. I love him as well. And if we saw last night's game, you saw how much he really became almost like the tight end 1. Now, it could be because Mark Andrews was so busy trying to occupy Kansas City defenders and was used as a blocker to kind of supplement what was a shaky offensive line performance for the Baltimore Ravens. But I still think that Isaiah Likely is an attractive option on waiver wires. Fantastic question. He did have, I believe, 80 yards, that one long touchdown. Could have had another touchdown there at the end of the game to tie it up. A toe away from a 2-touchdown performance for him. That's a fantastic question. If you have any more questions pertaining to the Chiefs-Ravens game last night, feel free. But let's get through Terry McLaurin's draft or pass segment as well, because I think Terry McLaurin's going to be an interesting piece. So let's talk about how he fits into the profile of the wide receivers and how this Washington Commanders offense really kind of fits the bill of how they're going to perform. So, like I was saying before, the supplementary pieces, I'm not saying they're fascinating. I'm not saying they're so good that they could take away some and eat into Terry McLaurin's targets. But I am saying that a lot of people might be skeptical that, well, with all the activity that the Washington Commanders did on the free agency market and picking up all these guys, they really think that Jaden Daniels is someone who can not only get down the field vertically, but can operate in a functional NFL offense with so many different weapons. With Austin Eckler in the backfield, they get him experience. With Zach Ertz at the tight end position, they get him experience. And with Terry McLaurin, they give him a true wide receiver 1. But when I look outside of that, I'm not necessarily worried about the other weapons. Maybe I'm worried about, say, Zach Ertz potentially getting a lot of red zone targets, or Austin Eckler and Brian Robinson Jr. having a say in the passing game out of the backfield. But at the end of the day, there isn't necessarily really anyone to kind of take away from what Terry McLaurin can do. He's a fascinating vertical threat. He's a fantastic route runner, high intelligence player, can make any catch, can really catch any ball that Jaden Daniels is willing to throw down the field because of his catch radius. And this year, I kind of feel like is the year where people will start to respect him more. Maybe he goes up different tiers in the kind of tiered view of the wide receiver market in fantasy terms. So that being said, draft Terry McLaurin. If you haven't done your draft already, Terry McLaurin is a fascinating option. I wouldn't take him in, say, the early rounds, like rounds 1 through 4. Maybe like he warrants a 9th, 10th round pick when you're trying to fill out your bench. Spot start kind of guy. And have to see how the rapport between him and Jaden Daniels develops. But he is an interesting prospect. That being said, I don't know how weird this Washington Commanders offense is going to get with all of these diverse weapons and pieces that they have. So it's really going to come down to if, as Tap to Learn says, who's the top option moving forward in the KC receiving core. Another fantastic question about last night's game from Tap to Learn here. At the current moment, I would say it's Rashee Rice, but it's just so versatile, this KC receiving core. I was really impressed with every single wide receiver in KC's receiving core, from Rashee Rice to Justin Watson even. And I was very especially appreciative of all the route concepts that Andy Reid was able to run with these guys on the offense. But that being said, I think Rashee Rice is just the most versatile. I think Mahomes trusts him the most out of this wide receiver core. Went to him early and often on crossing routes, slant routes, really just getting Mahomes in a rhythm. With that being said, Xavier Worthy is a bad man. He can get down the field. We saw how speedy he was. First touch in the NFL, first touch as a Texas Longhorns fan. I'm telling you, this guy is not just speed and verticality. He's a route runner. He's a very intelligent player. There may be concerns about drops, but last year with Texas, he did improve in that category. So look for him to be a nice weapon. But right now, to answer your question firmly and confidently, I think Rashee Rice profiles. Who knows? Maybe Marquise Hollywood Brown can be nice. Juju Smith-Schuster I don't necessarily think is going to ascend up the rankings all of a sudden. But overall, Rashee Rice seems like the most confident, competent wide receiver in this receiving core. So fantastic question about last night's game. And a question that will take us into our first break. Coming up next, we will be doing another draft to pass. I promise you guys we'll be getting into the excitement of betting previews and talking about tonight's game and some Sunday games. But we have another draft or pass segment about a rookie wide receiver who's entering an offense as perhaps a very daunting approach. We'll be right back to talk about who that is right after this short break.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we get into our second segment of the day here, we want to remind you to like, follow, and subscribe to the show on the network if you haven't already. Also, if you do feel so inclined, please consider using the features available to you on YouTube, Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers. They're a great support for the show, the network, me and my fellow podcasters as a whole. So anything you do, whether it be leave a tip or donation, leave a comment, question, concern, opinion, trade analysis, anything you leave is greatly appreciated by all of the network. And you are perhaps the best part of the show. So continue leaving comments, continue leaving questions, what have you, and this show will become much better. Without further ado, let's jump right into our next segment of the day. Another draft or pass, and I promise now and then the show will become a little bit more fun as we look ahead to the weekend in the NFL and college. But this guy really is kind of one of those enigmatic rookie receivers. As Tap to Learn says, sit or start Devontae Smith or Christian Watson. Now, let's talk about tonight's game a little bit prematurely. I'll get more into the details about tonight's game in a future segment, but this is a fascinating sit or start question. I like the fact that both the Packers and the Eagles have so much depth at the wide receiver position. The question about these two really stems down to, well, which quarterback is more likely to utilize their second option better? And right now it's Jalen Hurts and Devontae Smith. I'm not even sure Christian Watson will get the third most targets in this Packers offense. That's how deep that Packers wide receiving core is. I think that he had his chance to take the mantle of the wide receiver one position, but it might have been fate of circumstance with his injury history, but right now he's sitting very low in the pecking order, in my opinion, in terms of how he profiles. So this is an easy one for me. I would say sit Christian Watson and start Devontae Smith, because I think that at the end of the day, both of these guys are guys that are viewed as wide receiver twos. Maybe not Christian Watson, but if you want to put him in that category, I'll be fine with that. But Jalen Hurts trusts Devontae Smith more, and I just feel like Jordan Love became more comfortable with a lot of different targets than just Christian Watson. I think he's more comfortable with Jaden Reed. He may even more comfortable with a guy like Dontavion Wicks, who nobody had on their radar, than Christian Watson at the current moment. So I especially think that Devontae Smith will start the season right and get you a lot of fantasy points in tonight's game. We'll talk about that a little bit more later on in the show. But this draft or pass segment, like I said, is about an enigmatic rookie wide receiver going into an offensive situation that should suit him, but I don't really like. And the reason why is when I look at this wide receiver core outside of what he brings to it, there's just too much similarities. And for this particular team's quarterback, I want him to feel comfortable, because talking about him coming out of the draft many years ago, he was seen as this generational guy. I think that he just needs more weapons that can do many different things in this offense. And while I love this wide receiver, and I want this team to succeed because I really think they can be sneaky good, I just don't see it happening. Let's talk about the enigma that is Brian Thomas Jr. And a lot of people might not have even noticed him in terms of their drafts or in terms of the waiver wire. And that's because he's someone who is a very electrifying player, but I just don't see how he will supplement a team that already has so much verticality and not enough route running. However, there is a silver lining to what Brian Thomas brings to the table, because he is excellent at what he does. And it may not even matter that he is just another vertical receiver, for this Jacksonville wide receiving core. So let's talk about him a little bit. Last year at LSU, FBS high, 17 touchdowns. In fact, it was the third most in LSU history. 12 came on throws of 20 or plus yards. So as you can see, he does feast on fades, go routes, whatever have you, anything to get vertically down the field. Now, I think that if I were a Jacksonville Jaguars fan, then I would think this pick is exciting. Because Trevor, let's talk about him in this situation, is actually third in the NFL in passes of at least 10 air yards. It might shock some people, but he is very high statistically speaking in terms of getting the ball downfield. My only question is, how long is this going to sustain Trevor Lawrence until, they might start regretting giving him that much money? Because when I look at what Jacksonville Jaguars bring to the table in the receiving core, they have Christian Kirk, who is an iffy route runner at best, a speedster at best, and I just don't see him evolving outside of that. You add Brian Thomas Jr. to this equation, who I really like and I want to succeed, but did you really have to? And I know it feels weird because in this kind of wide receiver class, he did profile as perhaps the wide receiver 2 in this class behind a guy like Malik Neighbors, who was on the same team as him. But this Jacksonville Jaguars team is much different than LSU because LSU felt more confident with Jaden Daniels throwing the ball downfield than maybe they do with Trevor Lawrence. And that kind of is a little bit BS to me because that's exactly what can open up Trevor Lawrence, but it's also going to lead to his detriment as well if he doesn't have someone who can run routes properly for him and just goes down the field and tries to stretch the field as often as possible. Evan Engram, their tight end, cannot be the guy who's trying to get open while other people are so far downfield. That can't be the makeup of this offense is what I'm trying to say here. And in terms of Brian Thomas, I think that there's a point where he will evolve and progress as the season goes on to start becoming that kind of wide receiver one that they need. A guy who can run different routes. The guy who just doesn't always go up the field. Because at the end of the day, the bottom line is Trevor Lawrence does have the ability to go down the football field. He has that ability, and we can see it in his stats. But there needs to be levels to it. Because if he's going down the field all the time, chances are his turnover rate will continue to get higher. And, in fact, this is a prove-it season for him. Because if he doesn't, progress this season, then I think the Jacksonville Jaguars will regret putting so much money and investing so much into him. That being said, I think that this draft of Brian Thomas Jr. can also be seen as an advantageous thing. Because you're investing in a young receiver who does bring, even though a similar trait, at least he's very good at that one trait, and he has the chance to grow, and also he's going to remain on this team for at the very least 4 years. So he gives Trevor Lawrence a timeline to improve with him as well. So, that being said, when it comes to the question of draft or pass for Brian Thomas Jr., I would say pass in a standard league. Because at this current point in time, there are so many different wide receivers who I like at this point in time who either have the same attribute but are in an offense that can make that attribute work better or have just improved beyond what Brian Thomas Jr.'s starting level is. Like Tyreek Hill, for example, who is seen as perhaps the best fantasy wide receiver right now. Let's say CeeDee Lamb, I don't know, guys of that nature. there are guys who are just at a different level than what Brian Thomas Jr. is entering into the league is, and in a better situation overall. But I can see how it can be justified if Brian Thomas Jr. goes to the Dynasty League, because that connection will define the Jacksonville Jaguars for many years between him and Trevor Lawrence. If they can get that connection right, that can pay dividends down the road. And Trevor Lawrence as well might be more popular in Dynasty leagues than, a standard league. So my chips aren't necessarily all in on Brian Thomas Jr., whether it be in a standard league or a Dynasty league. But if I had to, decipher where to lay them, I think it's more in the improvement category than trusting him right away, because he is someone who could be very special for this Jacksonville Jaguars offense if he gets that connection right. But he could also be someone who just muddies the reputation of Trevor Lawrence and just makes this offense a little bit too speed-centric, if you know what I mean. So tread carefully with him. I just thought he would be an interesting player to do a deep dive into, even though he's probably not a big topic of discussion. I think he might be in future years. But to kind of welcome him into the league, so to speak, we do have to kind of talk about his situation a little bit, because he can either improve or he can kind of stay stagnant. As a result, the Jags will stay stagnant as well. But that will just about do it for this segment. Coming next, we switch our attention to the lesser position in fantasy, the defenses. How to pick them, how to value them, most importantly, in specific fantasy football leagues. I think it will be an interesting segment before we get into the meat of our episode. And we'll be right back after this short break to talk about that.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search
Hello everyone, and welcome back to this edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And for this third segment of today's show, I thought it would be interesting to shed light on a lesser position in fantasy. A position that a lot of people kind of disrespect, waited out on until the much latter stages of the draft. But a position that right now might be at its peak. And I'm not saying this position will either immediately win or lose you games, but it's a position that I think it's going to become highly pivotal once you actually see how they match up and how they can become of value to you. And so with this segment, I want to diagnose how to pick and value your defenses in fantasy football. A lot of you might just stream it week by week, try and pick a solid defense so you don't have to worry about it as the year goes on. But at the end of the day, you might find you're going to have a lot of pratfalls with your defense and how to set it up. But this year might be the year where a defense could win you a fantasy football league, just because of how the defenses have evolved this year. And if you see the stats and you see how they compared in years prior, defenses are just becoming better and better and more valuable to fantasy players. So that creates, therefore, more opportunities for you to do whatever you want with them. Because there may be a mishap in your draft where you wait a bit too long for a defense and you lose out on one that you really wanted and you're stuck streaming for the rest of the season. Or you immediately get this defense right away, but you start seeing some matchups that you don't really like as the season progresses, and you don't really know how to get the most out of your top defense and supplement it with another defense, or having to continuously stream. So this segment will hopefully prepare you for the volatility of the defense position in fantasy. Let's talk about some of the statistics, some of the positives that we've seen as defenses have been getting continuously better and better. This year especially, coming off of last year, looks like it could be a pivotal year for defenses. Last year, two defenses, and who we expect, the Browns and the 49ers, their average draft positions, their ADPs, were within the first 9 rounds. So that's a lot higher than a lot of people would project standard defense in fantasy. 4 of them went in the first 100 picks. And that's a little bit drastic. I think that a normal person, as Shep Easy said, I'm streaming for now, who's a good underrated D to pick up. That's a fantastic question, because I think that this year streaming will be, for the most part, very popular. An underrated defense. There seem to be a lot of them. I think that the way you define underrated with a defense can mean many different things. It can mean that you're looking maybe at a lower end of the top 10 defenses, or you're really looking for a defense that you think can break out. But if you want one specifically for week 1, the easy pick would be the Cincinnati Bengals. They are kind of projected as a top 10 defense. They have a lot of depth. They have a lot of talent along this defense. So they may have been picked up in the draft, but if they're still available out there, they have perhaps the easiest matchup of any team if they go up against the New England Patriots. And I don't necessarily see a way the Patriots will put up many points on them. Another team that's popular for this week, and maybe for the entirety of the season, and this is not, again, my bias. I stress this a lot. Whenever I talk about one of my favorite teams, this is not coming from a point of bias. It is, though, the Seattle Seahawks. Another team that's projected to have an easy go of it this weekend as they take on the Denver Broncos. At home, Mike McDonald, the new head coach, new defensive-minded head coach for that matter. So that matchup could project to be easy. But if you are streaming, it's all about matchups as well. You can't just think, oh, I can just stream a random defense and I'll be fine with it for the rest of the season. You have to do your research as well, because there will be times when you may not like the overall profile of a certain defense. You may have reservations about picking one up, but the matchup just fits you just fine. So if you are streaming, that's something that you may have to do more often. Whereas if you're confident in just picking one defense and sticking with it because of how good they are and how good they project to be, then you may have less worries. But if you are streaming for now, do pick them. Let's get back to the stats. But the stats are saying that more and more defenses are becoming highly coveted in drafts as well. So if you are in a last-minute draft, consider this. Like I said, 2 defenses, the ones you expect within the first 9 rounds with their ADPs, 4 going in the first 100 picks. That's actually the 4th consecutive season that defenses were picked that early. Now, it might be a little bit weird to think about, but as the season progressed, I think that as more youthful players came into the league for defense, I think that a lot of more teams became confident, and a lot more fantasy football managers became confident in these youthful players and getting integrated in this team, and thus it allows for a more wide open opportunity as years go on to analyze these defenses year by year. Let's say 4 years ago or so, you were streaming a defense, or you drafted a defense that you thought was underrated. In this way, you might have been able to follow this defense so that for this year's draft, when defenses are at their most popular, you can either draft them or say, hey, I can stream this defense if nobody has followed it like I did. So a lot more people have become more invested, I believe, in defenses as all of these young players, exciting players who just get integrated right into these defensive setups get in there. Like, for example, the Browns have integrated a lot of people. The Niners, The Colts are starting to integrate a lot of people. Another underrated defense to look out for, Shep Easy's sweet spot on the market. So a lot of teams are integrating these youth movements, and I think that's why people are drafting these defenses earlier and earlier. In terms of scoring, 2 defenses tied for the scoring lead. Again, who will expect 172 fantasy points. Only 89 position players, albeit one of them be a kicker if that matters to you, scored more. And that's more than the difference between the number 1 through 11 in overall fantasy players. Less than the difference between the numbers 1 to 3 quarterbacks. Half the difference between the numbers 1 and 2 running backs as well. So I think that just goes to show there's a discrepancy between defenses and your average skill position player, say a wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3, high-end kind of player there, is getting lesser and lesser. So if you are confident in drafting a defense, I think now is the year, especially if you were invested, say, in the rise of the defense, to pick your defense. I think that you can't go wrong with any of the top 10 defenses, but if you felt confident, watching the ascendancy of someone else, you might want to take a flyer on that. And so I think that defenses can be very crucial in drafts. I'm not saying that you necessarily want to place that much weight in trying to pick the primo defenses or the creams of the crop, but they are becoming more valued. So I am kind of letting you know that if you're in a situation where you are maybe stuck continuously streaming, you may regret it a little bit later on in the year. Let's talk about streaming for defense, because that's what the majority of people will end up doing and could end up doing. I think that, like I was saying, it's not always about trying to find the best defense. I think it's more about finding the matchups, like I said. For example, I think that this weekend there might be an example of these lower end defenses getting a lot of chances. For example, last couple of years, even though they were improving defense, the Jets and the Giants, they had a couple of good matchups as well. They were examples of teams that, even though, say, the offenses, and that's also a thing that matters, how good their offense is, they had some moments where they had good matchups. So let's say, going to that point, talking about teams who offensively might be weaker, that's a thing you can exploit as well. Say that, the Giants continuously are inept on offense. Then you can look at who's ever matched up against the Giants week by week and continuously stream those teams. So you're trying to set yourself up for success if you are stuck in continuously streaming by honing in on very weak offenses. They, in turn, might also have the best defenses, so that's where it gets complicated. I think that the Jets last year were a perfect example of that, where they had a fantastic defense, but they weren't in the best of situations, in terms of field position and stuff like that. They got a lot of turnovers for you, but they certainly weren't, limiting people's points tallies. So it's all about the matchups for streaming. That being said, the easiest strategy is following week by week, looking at teams with inconsistent offensive production, and honing in on the ultimate defensive pattern that best sets you up for success. I'm not saying that streaming is going to be all positive. There's going to be your peaks and your valleys, so you're going to have to take it as it comes. But at the end of the day, streaming isn't the worst thing that could happen to you in defense. But I am letting you know that drafting defenses has been getting more and more popular, and the discrepancy between low-end players that you might find in the latter stages of the rounds and these defenses are catching up. In terms of whether or not you wish to believe that you should be confident in drafting a defense, then that's up to you. But either strategy right now, you can't really go wrong. It's all about, if you're drafting, feeling very confident that your defense is one that you will stick with for the end of the year. And if you're streaming, putting yourself in a good situation where week by week you know the offenses that can be exploited and thus the defenses that best match up against those offenses. So it's all kind of a game here. It's all kind of setting yourself up for success. Hope the segment was helpful. Thank you all for the comments. And coming next, we get to the real nitty-gritty of the show. We start off in the NFL with our Week 1 betting previews, especially focusing on tonight's game in Brazil between the Packers and the Eagles. We'll be right back after the break to dive right into that.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. We have made it to the home stretch of today's show, and thus the nitty-gritty of today's show. The exciting part, I promise you guys, a comprehensive betting preview for both the NFL weekend and what should be a fascinating weekend in college football as well. That will come as our last segment of the day. Let's jump right into the NFL. Also, like I said, if you want to even talk about last night's game, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns about fantasy implications about last night's game, I will be willing and open to talk about everything that you choose to leave in the comments. But I actually do kind of want to touch on some of the fantasy implications for last night's game. Because there were, in my humble opinion, more questions about the fantasy implications of last night's game than any game this weekend, in my opinion. Everyone wanted to see the Chiefs wide receivers who would cement themselves as true wide receiver one, and thus a player that a lot of people would love to have on the open market. If Lamar Jackson and Derrick Henry, would have this kind of situation where one or the other is going to have a more dominant game, and we did see that. How about Isaiah Likely profiling perhaps as the tight end one for the Baltimore Ravens? No one had that on their bingo card. So there were a lot of different questions. The thing for me, for both teams, was for the Chiefs especially. No matter who's on the field for them at wide receiver, they're always going to scheme a guy open. I'm not saying that's going to translate to, a guy like Justin Watson suddenly being a high-end, say, wide receiver two, but I'm saying that it's a good thing in terms of production, say if you have Patrick Mahomes, but also an interesting thing week by week to see who might profile as a guy who's going to get more touches. I wasn't expecting, Xavier Worthy to get only 2 touches, but he did the most with them. I wasn't expecting, Rashee Rice to get as many early looks as he did, but he did the most of them. I wasn't expecting Travis Kelce, for the most part, to be kind of quiet this game. So expect the unexpected with the Kansas City Chiefs in terms of fantasy. And for the Ravens, I liked what I saw in Lamar in terms of his agility in the passing game. As Shep Easy Sweet Spot says, if Lamar runs that much week to week, is an injury waiting to happen. That's an interesting point. And especially if that offensive line can't hold up, I have a lot of trepidations about them as well. But for the most part, he looked very agile in open space. He took what the Chiefs defense gave him. But I am concerned not just about the O-line, but about the subsequent passing attack or lack thereof for the Ravens. I appreciated the fact that Justin Hill became a crucial part of that offense for some reason because of all the dump-offs. But if you're going to line up, Mark Andrews is almost like a tackle on your offensive line, then you're not going to have success. I was really disappointed in Mark Andrews. Yes, he was coming off some injuries, but I was really disappointed that he was used more as a blocker than as a pass catcher, because he is really Lamar Jackson, still his favorite weapon in my humble opinion in this offense. Yeah, Zay Flowers is going to have his moments. Rashad Bateman had a big moment. Isaiah Likely really stepped up, but I still think Mark Andrews needs to be an X factor in this offense. As for Derrick Henry, I kind of had a gut feeling he just wouldn't work, but at the end of the day, he still is someone who a lot of people might covet on the market, but just be wary of him. Maybe he's going to be more of a matchup week-by-week guy to see how, the Ravens will use him in the future. But that's my 2 cents. If you want to continue leaving comments about that game, you're free to do so. But let's jump into tonight's game. Taking place in Brazil. Should be a very exciting, as Tap to Learn says, Reed makes it hard to ride one horse on that offense. Very unpredictable. Yes, another good point. The unpredictability and versatility of that Chiefs offense is one that kind of gives me pause, but at the end of the day, it's about what those receivers make with those touches they get. Xavier Worthy didn't get many touches, like I said, but he made the most of them. Rashee Rice as well. Justin Watson, big catch. Only catch of the game, I believe. As Danny Finspan, I believe I'm saying that correctly, correct me if I'm wrong, has a trade. Or a suggestion in terms of, I believe this is a flex position that he's talking about. Jerome Ford or Christian Watson. We talked about Jerome Ford a little bit on yesterday's show. He's a player that I really, really like stepping up in the absence of Nick Chubb. But my question about him is, can he sustain it? But Christian Watson is another guy who you're a little bit worried about in injury history. So these are two guys who I have very different worries about. Jerome Ford, if he can truly step into the role, if the Browns need him to, as RB1 in that setup. And for Christian Watson, just to stay on the field and earn the trust, as Danny Finsman corrects me and says, start him or Christian Watson in my flex. So for a flex position, I would start Jerome Ford. And I want Christian Watson to, be a part of that Packers offense, but right now he is sinking lower and lower on that wide receiver depth chart, in my opinion. And Jerome Ford has a unique opportunity to take advantage of the absence of Nick Chubb and really step up in that Browns offense. I think he's going to get a lot of touches. The Browns running attack is always going to be very versatile, whether or not Nick Chubb is on the field. So I just love Jerome Ford. It's a tough matchup, I know, against the Cowboys. Their run defense, though, isn't as respectable as what they've done in the pass defense in terms of takeaways. So look for the Browns to try and exploit that. So I'm more confident in Jerome Ford at this current moment than Christian Watson, because I really don't know how many targets Christian Watson's going to get in that Packers offense. But fantastic question, because they're two differing players with two differing questions about them. But at the end of the day, I'm more confident in Ford, even though he has a tougher matchup. Let's talk about why I don't think Christian Watson will profile in this game and how it translates to the betting odds for tonight's game. As we all know, Packers-Eagles tonight, 8:15. And there's a lot of interesting storylines. These are two teams made the playoffs out of the NFC. And they really went in drastic directions once they got there. The Packers outperformed expectations. Nobody expected Jordan Love to be this good. No one expected that really young, the youngest wide receiver core in the NFL last year, to be as good as they were. And yet, they were one field goal away, perhaps, from beating the San Francisco 49ers on the road, so to speak, and going to the NFC Championship game. Whereas the Eagles, great start, terrible finish. Revamp in terms of coaching. Nick Sirianni brings in Kellen Moore as the OC. Let's see how that works out. My first bet I wanted to touch on in this game is about Jalen Hurts. And we got a question yesterday from a new subscriber, Cuppy. I hope if you're watching, I appreciated that comment yesterday. It was a fascinating question about how Saquon affects Jalen Hurts running, especially in terms of the brotherly shove. But this one is in terms of his passing. I'm going to take the over here in terms of Jalen Hurts. I believe it is minus 1,000, over 1.5 passing touchdown. Because at the end of the day, the Packers secondary, yes, it's perhaps the best part of that defense. Really love Jair Alexander. Acquired Xavier McKinney, one of the more underrated corners in the NFL. But I feel confident that Jalen Hurts' burden of being the guy to get the tough physical rushing yards on the ground is going to be released due to Saquon's presence. I feel like Saquon will open up this offense a lot more. Hopefully he's not, becoming more of a chunk play back, and he still has that explosiveness to him, because that will really factor in. But I'm not putting it past Jalen Hurts. I really kind of want him to focus on the passing game, because he has perhaps two of the top wide receiver 1s and wide receiver 2s in the league in A.J. Brown and Devontae Smith. And I want to see him exploit it. Kellen Moore profiles an exciting young offensive mind. Let's see what he can do in his first game as the OC. But I'm confident in minus 100. Not necessarily long odds here for Jalen Hurts to hit that mark. So why not? I think I'm confident that Jalen Hurts will progress to the point where, he's not always running just to run. He's running to pass as well, and also thinking about that in the back of his mind. So I feel like this is the perfect test game to get off the ground. And then to the other side, a guy who doesn't necessarily run as much, but still kind of uses his legs in different situations. Jordan Love, he's only projected in terms of the over 7.5 rushing yards, as Danny Finsman has got a little 5-legger with Philly money line. Hurts over 225 passing yards. Barkley over 80 yards and a touchdown. D. Smith 70 yards with any time touchdown. That's a very ambitious one. Wishing you the best luck there. I think that I'm confident about Hurts. I'm kind of confident about Barkley as well. But the question lays in Devontae Smith, because a lot of people are expecting him to step up and be that almost a wide receiver 1 in the system. They expect him to supplant A.J. Brown as the wide receiver 1, but I don't want to see it. I want to see Devontae Smith run more aggressive routes. I want to see him more in the red zone. And I want to see Jalen Hurts continue to rely on him as a deep field threat, because that way Jalen Hurts will gain more trust in his deep ball, and thus it will open up more avenues for this offense. So that's an interesting 5-legger. In terms of the money line as well, I am a little skeptical. I don't have the money line in front of me. I do believe that Philly is favored in this game. Don't quote me on that. But at the end of the day, it's going to be a highly competitive game. I see at least 2 of those hidden for you, but I'm not necessarily sure this entire thing will hit. But good luck to you. Otherwise, Danny, thank you for your comments. Thank you for joining the show as well. But let's get back to Jordan Love. Let's get back to his inability kind of as a rusher, whereas we're more confident in Jalen Hurts to potentially rush for more yards. Over 7.5 rushing yards, though, that's a very low total for him. And, he's going to try to distribute the wealth in this first game offense, take advantage of a very young, kind of transitioning secondary in Philly. I'm not necessarily sure how many different players will be starting in the secondary. They still have Darius Slay there. They have Reed Blankenship, who they're seeming to rely upon more and more. And they drafted Quinyon Mitchell and Cooper DeJean, versatile in his own right. And Quinyon Mitchell brings a lot of speed to the back end as well. So he doesn't know how it's going to translate on the field in their secondary. So look for Jordan Love to try to take advantage of that. But I still think there will be moments where he might improvise, might have a little bit of a design run. So I think I'm comfortable in saying that Jordan Love will get at least 7.5 rushing yards. That's still a little too low in my opinion for him. But then just looking around the week as well, outside of tonight's game, looking ahead to Sunday's slate, There are some interesting bets there, and I want to start in a very interesting game, Steelers-Falcons. Bijan Robinson. Now that it seems like the Falcons want to use him more, Raheem Morris said, we are going to use Bijan Robinson more. Now they have a competent quarterback. His receiving numbers should go up. I always loved him out of the backfield at Texas, and now I think Raheem Morris will have a better understanding of his receiving abilities than Arthur Smith did. Look for him to get a lot of red zone targets and thus hit the over in terms of receiving yards at 25.5. Then going over to Vikings-Giants. Justin Jefferson, over 82.5 receiving yards. We obviously don't know the connection that he'll be able to develop with Sam Darnold, but he still is the number one target for him at the end of the day. So look for Sam Darnold to look for him early and often, get a lot of targets, and thus perhaps a lot of yardage. And the final one that I want to cover, how about my Seahawks taking the segment of today's show? Coming next, we transition to week 2 of the college football season. Should be a wacky week 2, a lot of great games. We'll be right back to close out today's show and the week with that segment. Hello everyone and welcome back to the last segment on today's show of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, and it should be yet another good one. We are transitioning from the NFL Week 1 betting preview to the Week 2 betting preview of what should be a fascinating Week 2 in college football. 3 big games, even 4 big games that we could touch upon in terms of betting previews. Interesting storylines as well that we're going to be touching upon as we look ahead to tomorrow's fascinating slate of games. And, you know, Week 2 always tells the story of a college football team, no matter who you're playing. This is the week where we really start to understand who's for real and who's not. There are some teams that are ambitious scheduling, as we'll see as we go through the 3 games I want to highlight. But there are some teams who are still tuning up as well. So without further ado, let us jump right into our college football betting preview, starting off with the biggest game of the weekend. As Big Bad Texas heads up to Ann Arbor, the big house, to take on the defending national champion, Michigan Wolverines. Fascinating game, fascinating storylines. Reminds me as a Texas Longhorns fan of last year's game, Week 2, where Texas went into Alabama, got a statement win. And the reason why I mentioned ambitious scheduling is because Texas takes advantage of this. Texas plays the long game in terms of scheduling games early on in the season where maybe they can catch a team off guard and hope that it holds up as the season goes on and as that team themselves improves. It really showed last year when they went into Jordan-Hare Stadium, went into Tuscaloosa, beat Bama, and knew that Bama were good enough to improve and maintain a level of success, and they were in the playoffs because they had to honor that head-to-head win after Alabama upset the odds and beat Georgia in the SEC championship game. So that's what this game is looking like. Not the biggest games on either of these teams' schedules, though, but it's still an interesting game to see. Right now, on the road, Texas is actually favored, giving 3.5 points to Michigan. The money line is minus 178. The over-under, 48.5 in terms of points. And the big storyline lays in the quarterback for Texas, Quinn Ewers. Can he do what he did last year against Alabama, where he had perhaps his best game in a Texas uniform, and impress scouts even further with his ability to show that he truly has matured and can truly stay consistent as he goes to the NFL next year? And against a Michigan defense that has a lot of talent, but maybe not as much talent as defenses past for Michigan, they still have Kenneth Grant, Mason Graham up front, and Will Johnson, perhaps the best cornerback in college football, on the back end. But the reason why I'm still confident in saying that Texas should win this game, maybe not as handily as people think, is because when I look at last week's game against Colorado State or Texas, and this is definitely kind of not necessarily the best information to give you because it was Colorado State, and they should have won the game handily. What I was impressed about with Quinn Ewers was the fact that all of his touchdown passes came in the red zone, which is what Texas kind of struggled with last year. Diversity in the red zone when they got there. Because Quinn Ewers, a lot of people will agree that one of his best assets is his deep ball. Breaking down the defense vertically. Threatening the defense vertically. It was what he did last year against Alabama. This year, though, breaking in a much different wide receiver core than he had with Texas last year, where he had the speed of Xavier Worthy, the intelligence and downfield intelligence, most importantly, of A.D. Mitchell, and the brilliant seam route running from Natavion Sanders. Now it's Isaiah Bond, fantastic route runner, fantastic red zone threat. Matthew Golden, probably the speedster in this offense, but can still run a solid route. And Silas Bolden, who will perhaps profile as the vertical threat. So it's going to be interesting to see if Quinn Ewers and Texas offense gets a lot of opportunities in the red zone, how they go up and match up against this defense. That's where I'm more excited. In terms of Michigan, I think the X factor is a guy a lot of people are underestimating, and that is tight end Colson Loveland, because they're going to try to win this game on the ground. They're going to try to grind Texas defense down. By the way, Michigan's offense shouldn't underestimate Texas defense. Texas defense is more than capable of putting their offense in advantageous situations. But at the end of the day, Michigan's offense is going to try and tire out this Texas defense by grinding the ball on the ground. But you're going to need some kind of outlet if you're either Davis Warren or Alex Orji to pass the football. And Colson Loveland is your main hope at the receiver position to do just that. Who knows? Maybe Sharon Moore will try and keep up with Texas, and maybe he'll have Davis Warren throw the ball more vertically down the field. But at the end of the day, I think that in terms of Michigan's game plan, they need to think about a contingency plan if the run game isn't working. And Colson Loveland seems like the perfect outlet. But at the end of the day, it's all going to come down to Texas's red zone offense, Michigan's game plan, and Quinn Ewers. If Texas' red zone offense is effective, if they can even get to the red zone and score from that vantage point, then they're already ahead of the game. If Michigan's game plan is going to be ground and pound on the ground, do they have an outlet in third and long, third and short situations as a receiving option? And then Quinn Ewers, can he do it again? Those questions are going to need to be answered in order for me to give you. But that being said, I'm taking Texas. I think they'll cover, and I think the over should hit, because I think Texas's game plan of making this a shootout will be the predominant one. I think that I'm more confident in just taking Texas outright than saying that this game will hit any over. But transitioning to the next game on the docket this week in Colorado at Nebraska. Now, if this was the 1990s, when both of these teams were consistently in the AP top 10, this game probably would have meant a little bit more, but it's still a very exciting game because of the many different storylines here. Nebraska's at home in Lincoln, and they are giving 6.5 points. Money line minus 200, over under an impressive 56.5. Now, I think this is all going to come down to the quarterback battle, because both of these quarterbacks are very solid. In redshirt freshman Dylan Raiola, who last week had a fantastic performance, 19 of 27, 288, 2 TDs, and Isaiah Neyer, who was of Wyoming, had injury problems at Texas, Fame, coming in, consistent transfer, immediately developing that rapport. They have a solid foundation in offense. Their O-line is great. Their D-line is pretty consistent as well. On Colorado's side, you perhaps have the best 3 players in this game in Shedeur Sanders, Travis Hunter, and Jimmy Horn. So you just got to get all 3 of those guys going. They perhaps are lacking in terms of offensive line depth at the moment. Their defense should be steadily improved at this point. But I think that this game is going to be a shootout, and it's going to come down to which quarterback can stay the course, which quarterback can rely on this wide receiving core. I'm not confident that Nebraska will cover the spread, but I actually think that they'll win this game. It's at Lincoln. There's a sense of rejuvenation in the system. Matt Rule is responsible for a lot of success at the college level in terms of the second-year jump. Did it with Temple, did it with Baylor, and in Dylan Raiola, he has a confident young quarterback who has an experienced receiving core and has a lot of depth in his team that he can trust. So at the end of the day, I'm taking Nebraska not to cover the spread. I'm taking the under here. So it's going to be an interesting game. I think it's going to be an exciting game, but that's the only advice I can give you. It doesn't necessarily mean much, like I said, but it's still an exciting game to contemplate. And the last game that we're going to cover here on today's show, Iowa State versus Iowa, the Cy-Hawk rivalry. And this is an interesting one, because when I think about both of these teams, I think about their defenses more than I do their offenses this season. That being said, Iowa really impressed me in the second half of their game against FCS Illinois State, who was predicted to be one of the better FCS teams in the nation. They are still an FCS team, though. But at the end of the day, the bottom line is this is going to be a very physical game. Whatever you get, like an in-state rivalry, it's always going to be physical. It's almost like a divisional game in the NFL. Both of these teams not even in the same conference, but they are still going to be very physical with each other. That being said, both of these quarterbacks have interesting profile, because Rocco Beck, very underrated quarterback out of Iowa State, had an interesting season last year, decent season last year, and Cade McNamara, well, he played in a Big Ten championship game with Michigan, and he brings that experience to Iowa. Looked pretty good last week, and if he can stay healthy, who knows what the Iowa Hawkeye season will look like, especially on offense as they try to improve there. But I think this game will come down to which defense is better, and Iowa State, as someone who's watched a lot of Big 12 football, as a Texas fan, Iowa State's defense has to be one of the most physical and dominant and hard to score against in the entire Big 12, and that's not a joke. So I think this game can be dragged to Iowa State's advantage. Thus, I'm not taking Iowa in the points here. I'm taking Iowa State outright. The over-under, yeah, it's a moot point at this point, because the joke is going to be this game is going to be very low scoring.